This episode of New Politics was released on the 6th of July, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the battle for the heart and soul of the Labor Party, the trend of more government funding for private schools continues, Britain has a new Prime Minister, and should Australia be worried about the far right coming to Europe and a possible return of Donald Trump in the United States? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, Conservative Party campaign manager.
Just a reminder, we don't have the billionaire owners or even the millionaire owners to support us, and that's the way that we'd like to keep it. But if you would like to support New Politics, you can do that through Patreon or Substack, or you can make a donation at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. The battle for the heart and soul of the Labor Party continues, and an issue that we thought might end up blowing over has resulted in the suspension of Senator Fatima Payman from the Labor Caucus, and now she has resigned from the Labor Party and will continue as an independent senator for at least the next 4 years.
Our actions must align with our principles. When history looks back, it must see that we stood on the right side of humanity even when it was difficult. Sadly, I do not believe our principles align with those of the leadership of the Labor Party. With a heavy heart but a clear conscience, I announce my resignation from the Australian Labor Party. I have informed the Prime Minister that effective immediately, I will sit on the crossbench to represent Western Australia.
And there was a bit of semantics over this suspension. It was promoted as a suspension for not following the Labor caucus rules, but we know that in reality it's about her position on Gaza and crossing the floor of the Senate to vote with an Australian Greens motion calling for the Australian government to recognise the state of Palestine. And there's also been a lot of claim and counterclaim about this, with accusations that the Greens are just playing politics with all of this. And there was also the suggestion that Senator Payman is just being naive and being used by the Greens. And last week we suggested that the Labor Party would be making a very big mistake in the move to expel or suspend someone who is articulate, young, female, a woman from an Islamic background, even if it was purely for political reasons to keep a link with that demographic electorally. But David, they've gone ahead and made that big mistake that we warned them about.
For a party that's supposed to be about social justice and looking after the lower classes and minorities, the only way they could have botched it worse was to absolutely kick Senator Payman out rather than let her step down herself. I know the caucus arguments, and I know that it's been a long time since a Labor member has crossed the floor, but Labor members have crossed the floor in the past. The reasons that caucus solidarity were put in, and I started saying this last week and moved off the track, so for those of you who are saying, hey, what was it? It was so that the 6 disparate Labor parties could be united on the floor of a fairly fragile parliamentary setup. You had the so-called 311s, as Deakin called it, where you had the Free Traders, the Protectionists and the Labor Party. And the Free Traders and the Protectionists didn't much like the Labor Party. And Labor knew that if it wasn't 100% united on the floor of Parliament, it would be destroyed. So they did all their arguing in caucus and then presented a unified front. Now, the issues back then were different too. We didn't have these types of things that go to the heart of a person's belief. 1917, where we see the first major Labor Party split start. That happens with conscription. Should we send working class people off to die? Yes, because we need to protect Australia's role in the world. No, because it's wrong to send people off to die. 1935, over the economy. Should we actually fix the economy in a way that helps everyone? Or should we use traditional ways that are guaranteed to work almost? And the party splits again. Then in 1954, it was over communism. Should communism thinking play a part in Labor Party politics? And the party splits again. The party is historically overdue for a split. I'm not saying I want it to split. I'm not saying it should split, but I'm saying in terms of every 20 to 25 years, it split till 1954. Now, you might argue that the taking over of the party by essentially neoliberal thinking, with Bill Hayden becoming Treasurer in 1977 and then Bob Hawke becoming Prime Minister in 1983, you could argue that that constitutes a split in the party. It's just a better managed split. We're still a bit overdue, although maybe the Rudd years constituted a kind of split. But in terms of the violent splitting that see new parties formed, that type of split hasn't happened for a long time. It may be that we're heading towards the end of the party system anyway, or the Westminster party system, and something new is coming. But that's probably a bit too big of a discussion to be held now.
Oh, but I think that on this occasion, it seems that the Labor Party doesn't want its conscience pricked about anything. And essentially, Senator Payman is saying all the things that the members of the caucus should be saying, or probably would be wanting to say. And it also goes without saying that when you've got 104 members of caucus, that's a lot of different people. And of course, to be a member of the Labor Party, there's going to be a general consensus about what the values of the Labor Party are, but everyone comes into any situation with their own background, their own life experiences and their own interpretations of that situation. But the Labor platform from 2021 on Palestine is very, very, very clear, and that's to recognise Israel and Palestine within recognised borders, call on the next Labor government to recognise Palestine as a state, and the expectation that this issue is an important priority for the next Labor government. And I'm not making this up. This is lifted directly from the Labor platform. And guess what? We've got the next Labor government, and none of these things have been remotely worked on, not even before October the 7th last year. So a lot of people have been saying, well, Fatima Payman should have known about the caucus rules. She knows what the game is, and now she has to suffer the consequences. But the other issue is that Fatima Payman also knows what's in the Labor platform. And the Labor platform is developed by the members, union representatives and caucus members as well. And when the Israel-Palestine issue becomes as big as it is in 2024, when the Labor Party is finally in government and now ends up being the time to support the recognition of two states within recognised borders and recognise the state of Palestine, after the Labor Party said that the issue will be an important priority for the next Labor government and doesn't do anything about it when it gets into government, well, that's what the problem is. And the Labor caucus has not delivered on this particular issue as far as I'm concerned. And they can't just say, well, you know, the Labor platform, well, that's just the rank and file membership. You know, what will they know? The Labor caucus was a key part of the development of the Labor platform, and they're not following it.
We find ourselves in a strange situation. Labor platform, the rank and file members want Palestinian recognition. They want the genocide to stop. Yet the parliamentary party doesn't want that. Now, there's a whole range of reasons that we could guess at. Treaties and agreements and keeping the balance of international relations, etc. AUKUS.
But I guess all of those splits within the Labor Party that you mentioned before, was that split between caucus and the rank and file and union memberships as well?
Yeah, always. My point was that being in government is different to not being in government. But there's no point in being in government if you're not following as closely as you can the wishes and beliefs of your rank and file. And this is what happens in all of them. When you join the Labor Party, the first thing you're told is once caucus says it, that's it, there's no going against caucus. The other thing too is that Ireland, a country made up of two opposing centre-right parties with Sinn Féin trying to get through as a centre-left party, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, are both really centre-right parties with slightly different. It recognised Palestinian statehood without much controversy. Now, of course, Ireland has a vastly different history and a history that has always supported the Palestinians. But neither Fianna Fáil nor Fine Gael are terribly radical, and you could imagine them saying, oh, well, we don't support it for all these kinds of reasons. Ireland just said, yep, we acknowledge Palestine as a state, and it made the papers, but it made the papers as the same as if they were announcing the extending of a new highway or something. Just another piece of policy that people should know about, but it wasn't a big deal. Here, it looks like it's going to tear a party apart. If the people they say they're going to leave the party do leave the party, even if half of them do, it's going to be catastrophic for membership and for future election campaigns. Now, whether they leave or not is a whole other question. People say things in the heat of the moment, and sometimes they think on it and realise they can affect change better from within or what have you. I'm not judging people who say they're going to leave and don't. And then there's, of course, those members who've doubled down, and it's quite possible that there's a split coming.
I guess we just have to wait and see what the outcome there is. But for me, we've got this situation where Labor is supposed to be a progressive political party, and you touched on some of those issues before, David, but it's got all of these rules, regulations and procedures from yesteryear. It's almost sclerotic, and I just don't think that it offers the party the flexibility to deal with the modern age. And I'm not suggesting that you don't have any rules at all within a political party, or that you shouldn't have the opportunity to install or instill discipline within a political party. And of course you need that. And especially when you're dealing with so many different types of people and different egos from different backgrounds. But you're just not getting enough flexibility between that relationship of caucus and when they're in government, and the ideals and the beliefs of the Labor Party and the rank and file membership. And there were also those reports that Penny Wong chided Fatima Payman on the sidelines of the Senate and said, well, hang on, I had to support the caucus decision not to support marriage equality, and I had to wait 10 years before it was introduced. But that's the whole point, Penny. You didn't speak up about it. You didn't oppose the stupidity of the caucus to oppose same-sex marriage at that time. You didn't stand up to Julia Gillard when she said that marriage is only between a man and a woman, and you ended up having to wait 10 years, and it wasn't the Labor Party that introduced marriage equality. It ended up being the Liberal Party that introduced it, albeit with the flawed process of plebiscite and postal vote and all those sort of things. So spare us this rubbish about caucus solidarity on key issues. You speak up on these key issues when the time comes, and you speak up when you have to. So using Penny Wong's sentiment or Penny Wong's logic, it will probably end up being the Liberal Party in about 10 years' time that recognises the state of Palestine, when it should be the Labor government doing it right now, when the issue does really matter.
I'll give Penny Wong the benefit of the doubt and suggest that she probably did argue it very passionately in caucus and got voted down. But that just shows the flaw of the system, because I suspect most of the Labor members, not all, the leadership of the Shoppies Union were the driving force behind, and some of the more conservative Catholic members, who I think was essentially the Shoppies Union leadership fell into that anyway, were the ones who were able to force the vote in caucus. And okay, the vote happened, the opposition was put through, but it was paradoxical. It was like when the Shoppies Union was run by Joe de Bruin. He was at odds, I think, with a lot of Shoppies membership, many of whom were young, progressive types working in game shops and fashion shops and things like that. However, he kept getting elected till he leaves the party, feeling that the party was a different thing to what he joined. Can't argue with that. So it's kind of a shame that Labor waits in opposition and is a fairly effective opposition for 9 years of some of the worst governments we have, and is now going to rip itself apart over the difference between what they want or what they feel they want in government and what they want in the rank and file. The next couple of weeks, I think, might be very interesting.
The other factor is that the Prime Minister has made this a bigger issue than it needed to be, or the Prime Minister and the Labor Party, and you think, well, who are these actions directed towards? Is it the other caucus members who complained about not following rules and procedures, saying, well, hang on, Albo, you didn't let me speak about this issue or that issue and I didn't cross the floor? Or is it directed at the Israel lobby for the Prime Minister to say, oh, sorry about that. We had a Labor senator calling for the recognition of the state of Palestine. We can't have that. Leave it with me and I'll deal with the problem. And certainly not directed at the Labor Party rank and file membership, because they'd be pretty annoyed about this suspension. And there was a branch in Albanese's seat of Grainler that passed a motion supporting the actions of Senator Payman, and that was the Leichhardt branch. And Albanese could have just let it go, but it's just become a bigger problem than it needed to be. And Anthony Albanese's big Labor Party hero, Tom Uren, he crossed the floor back in the 1960s. Jim Cairns also crossed the floor, as did Kim Beazley Sr., and they ended up becoming senior figures within the Labor Party. And Jim Cairns goes on to become the Deputy Prime Minister and the Treasurer. So there are many issues within Israel and Palestine which should be of concern to Labor Party caucus members. And aside from the lack of recognition of the state of Palestine, even though that's what Labor has promised to do according to its platform, there's also the continuing military export permits with Israel. And there's been at least 8 since October the 7th last year. There were 52 the year before, and 66 in the year before that one. And there was also a $917 million contract signed earlier this year with the Israel military tech firm, Albert, to supply military technology to Australia. And this is the same technology that has been used to arm the military regime in Myanmar and also to kill Palestinians in Gaza. So there's good reasons for Labor MPs and senators to cross the floor in Parliament. And maybe the ones who don't do that are the ones that should be suspended, not Fatima Payman.
No matter how you look at it, even if you think Fatima Payman did the wrong thing and should be suspended, the party management have botched this. No matter which way you go from it, she could have spread the floor. The mainstream press would have been sclerotic for a few days, apoplectic even, and had they shut up about it, it would have gone away. And sure, Senator Payman may not have got into those parliamentary groups and committees, and it may have delayed her entry into cabinet or at least the outer ministry for a few years. But she'd have made her point, the party would have shown their disapproval, and in a few weeks we'd have forgotten about it. And it would be the type of thing that in a few years some podcast will be saying when the next one crosses the floor, well, Senator Payman, Jim Cairns, Tom Uren, all cross the floor.
Well, it might be us repeating the same material.
Yeah, it might be too. It has painted Labor into a corner now. All they can do is be grateful that they don't have a terribly competent or bright opposition who could exploit this further. But you don't have to be too bright to stick to the adage of there's no point in interrupting your enemy when he's making a mistake. I think that even if they let it blow up, and we'll be feeling the ripples for weeks rather than days. This is probably what they call a rookie mistake or a schoolboy error. But I think it's a fairly monumental one, and I think we may be seeing the beginning of the end of the Labor Party as we know it.
And in the context of the suspension of Fatima Payman from the Labor caucus and her subsequent resignation, there's new opinion poll numbers that show that the approval ratings for Anthony Albanese have fallen again. And while he still is the preferred Prime Minister in the latest news poll, and that's 46% to 38%, it's almost like having a poll with gangrene as the competitor. He should be way ahead in the polls. And his disapproval rating is as high as the opposition leader Peter Dutton's is at 53%. In the essential poll, Albanese now has a net approval rating of -9, and that's his worst ranking ever. And as we've pointed out many times before, these are just opinion polls, and opinion polls outside of election times don't mean very much at all, but they do mean something. And before people start thinking that this is the end of the Labor government, it's not. Governments have been in far worse positions and gone on to win elections. And in any case, the Labor government is polling 51% to 49% in the two-party preferred terms at the moment, which is an election-winning position. So there's been a lot of debate about those falling poll numbers for Anthony Albanese, that they suggest that the decision to suspend Senator Payman from the Labor Party will cost it more votes and lead to more disapproval of Anthony Albanese's performance. I don't think it will. This is really a peripheral issue, and very few people are talking about it or taking notice about it. We obviously are, but that's a different matter. But it is a question of what does the Labor Party represent? If it's not going to act on these issues and it's going to behave in this sort of manner, and if it's not acting in accordance to the Labor Party platform, and there's probably going to be a lot more issues that affect these opinion polls. But all of these issues, all the big issues and the smaller ones, they do have a cumulative effect on voter perceptions and ultimately the vote on election day. And this is only a tiny issue, but it's definitely something the Labor Party could have handled in a much, much better way. And because they haven't, ultimately they've lost one vote in the Senate, and that could be a very important vote over the next 4 years.
If you look at the English or the British Parliament, where Boris Johnson had a couple of 100-seat majority, and over the years it's been whittled down to about 80 through mostly scandalous resignations. Anthony Albanese has 5 seats in the lower house. All it will take is some kind of issue where they will be relying on her vote, and she may not want them. Another old saying, be careful of the toes you step on today because they may be hanging off the legs that are connected to the bum you have to kiss tomorrow. And everyone listening knows that there were better ways. And I suspect everyone listening to has a different way, and they're all better ways. And they went down the worst one. Because not only will it be a Labor Party thing, as in membership of the party, it will be people in safe or heretofore safe Labor seats with large Middle Eastern populations. And let's not forget, it's not just a Middle Eastern issue. There are Palestinian Christians. There are Farsi people. You have atheists and agnostics in the land of Palestine. It's a humanity issue, and that's where people forget.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
Whenever I'm down, I call on you, my friend. A helping hand you lend in my time of need. Whenever I'm down, I call on you, my friend. I call on you, my friend. I call on you, my friend. Listen.
And another area that the Labor government is not behaving in a way that we'd expect a Labor government to behave is funding for private schools. And there's more money being pumped into private schools, and there's going to be an additional $1 billion of capital infrastructure over the next 4 years from the federal government going to the private school sector, while the public school sector won't be getting any increases at all. And on a pro rata basis, federal funds for private school infrastructure is more than twice the amount spent on public schools. And I realise that education is never just about the quality of the buildings or how many swimming pools a school has or ovals or playing fields or whatever. It's always going to be about the quality of the teaching and developing a love of learning for the students. But these figures are quite drastically rigged towards the private school system in Australia, which has got one of the most unbalanced schooling systems in the world. And most of this is a leftover of having federal coalition governments in office for 20 years since 1996, and we can't expect a Labor government to rectify the situation within 2 years. But you'd also expect a Labor government to be reversing this trend, not amplifying a problem by giving an already well-funded private school sector more money that it doesn't need.
Even America, the land of neoliberalism, doesn't directly fund its private schools. Britain, the land of Eton, of Harrow, of Rugby, they are all privately funded. Now, I know that particular governments sneak money to them through back doorways, legal and proper, etc. But the shoveling of the vast funds at the expense of smaller public schools, at the expense of all public schools, overcrowded inner city schools in Melbourne and Sydney, Indigenous schools in the far west or east if you're in Western Australia, or north in South Australia, where they can't even afford air conditioning and have to try and get through 40-degree days with a ceiling fan. The government funding is just not justifiable and never has been. Their fees are still the same as what they always... It's not actually relaxing the fees.
Well, the fees have actually gone up in so many cases.
So the principals get overpaid, the board gets overpaid, you get lovely swimming pools and auditoria. And I've said this before, it's the same curriculum. It's the same teachers, in that the teachers have to have the same qualifications. So you're not actually getting anything better except for the buildings. And the buildings aren't the thing that provide a quality education. They may provide a quality experience. So, and again, this is not all schools, and it's not all people who work in private schools. I don't want to pick on the individuals who have jobs.
Yeah, of course. And I don't think that's our point when we're raising all of these issues. But all of this is new research provided by the Australian Education Union. And this issue just seems to be a very hard issue to crack. And there has been this long-running debate in Australia about private versus public schools. But whatever the merits of that are, if all schools are going to be funded by governments, it should be a case where all of them are funded adequately and not forcing more public funds into private school education. And this ends up being a process that goes through a downward spiral, I think, where public schools end up being poorly resourced and poorly funded. Parents feel like they'll have to provide a better education for their children if they pay for a private school. And this ends up being a political issue where federal governments put in more money into private schools and then it ends up becoming a vote winner. And I just find this process quite bizarre. But if the current trajectory of funding continues and the movement from the public school sector to the private school sector continues as well, in around 20 years' time, 60% of all schools across Australia will be private and 40% will be public. And as you mentioned, they all still have to follow the same curriculum, but this is a massive shift that's going on within school education, and it's hard to see how it's going to change under the current political and funding settings.
What it does is destroys community. School is one of those areas in which members of the community can meet. Now, it's not all members of the community. You've got to pretty much have kids there or be a teacher there or admin staff or support staff. But a lot of strong community actions come out of a lot of public schools. And that's, of course, what the Liberal Party don't like. So, why Labor is doing this. And they may have been stuck by some piece of legislation that was hiding there and then came up and they're forced to do it. But legislation can be changed. And I think we're through the era where it was Robert Menzies who starts funding Catholic schools. And a lot of the local Catholic schools were bereft of funds. So instead of going to the Catholic Church and saying, hey, look at all that money you've got, if you want these schools to survive because you're not getting any government money, he starts funding Catholic schools, which, of course, at a time when the Labor Party was splitting over partly the role of Catholicism in the Labor movement, was able to get the Liberal Party or parties like the Democratic Labor Party who shoveled their preferences through to the Liberals. They dominate the 1950s and 60s. Labor can't win from here because it just means you get a whole range of Liberal voters coming through the system and then when they hit 18, voting Liberal.
Well, I guess that also brings up that other issue about, now that you mentioned Menzies and Catholicism, that most of these private schools are run under the auspices of religious institutions, and that includes Anglican, Catholic, some Muslim and Pentecostal schools. And for me, it's been just so entrenched for a long time that not many people seem to have an issue with this. And there just doesn't seem to be a friend of public schools out there within governments, either federal, state or territory governments. Public schools are always begging for funding, or they're at loggerheads with state and territory governments about working conditions and pay deals and those sort of things. And all schools are the responsibility of state and territory governments, but federal government has become more involved in the funding of schools as well. And as you mentioned, that sort of went back to the Menzies government back in 1964 or whenever it was when they started funding Catholic schools. And they were in very poor condition at the time, but that's resulted in political payback for the Liberal Party, with more traditional Catholic Labor voters moving over to the Liberal Party. And that involvement of the federal government in school funding, anticipating that there'll be some sort of political benefit in return, that's continued up until today, and it's just hard to know what can be done here. We did have those Gonski reforms that were meant to equalise the playing field, but that was poorly implemented by the Gillard government and then completely botched up by the Liberal Party once they assumed office in 2013. And, you know, it was botched up, but not by accident. So it's probably going to continue for some time to come, I'd say.
We've lost a generation, I think. We've lost a generation of teachers who were working under impossible conditions, students who didn't have the funding to be properly supported, students who didn't get opportunities that they might have got had there been a much more equitable system, and we're looking at losing another generation. Both parties have a lot to answer for when it comes to this. Scrap all public funding of private schools. That's where we start. And then one of the sort of big lies they tell is, if we stop funding private schools, the public system couldn't handle it. Whereas, of course, the money that had been going into the private system could easily be fed into the public system. And that's easily covered. So I think those who want to opt out of the system, okay, opt out of the system. But you don't get to be paid and rewarded for it.
A Labour landslide being predicted by Verdict by the catastrophe of Labour Prime Minister in history.
Exit poll is just like amazing. I mean, 14 years of Tory chaos and we are finally out of it, and we are out of it with a huge bang. I mean, 410 seats for Labour is just amazing. This is probably the highest result they've ever had. So this is really, really good.
I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to have some competent governance moving forward. That's all I hope for, because it's been very clear to me for a long time that we've had a party that's been in power that's more interested in being the party in power rather than actually governing.
Because tonight people here and around the country have spoken, and they're ready for change, to end the politics of performance and return to politics as public service. The change begins right here, because this is your democracy, your community and your future. You have voted. It is now time for us to deliver. Thank you very much.
The UK Labor Party has won the British election, and it's been a foregone conclusion for almost 2 or 3 years, ever since the Conservatives had that bizarre leadership of Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss and then Rishi Sunak. And the Conservatives have pretty much led Britain into a path of destruction. It's now out of the European Union through the Brexit campaign, and most British people now believe that that was a big mistake. There's also severe economic problems. Inflation is high compared to other European nations. High interest rates, stagnant wages. The economy was also in recession last year. Now, it's really difficult to know what the new Prime Minister Keir Starmer is going to be like, who must have looked over to Australia to see what happened with Labor losing the election in 2019 by offering too much material to the public, and then seeing what Anthony Albanese did by saying nothing and then going on to win the 2022 federal election and thinking, well, this is what you need to do to win the election, and say nothing and do nothing. And just to repeat what you said before, David, which is that old Napoleonic saying that you should never interrupt while your opponent is making all the mistakes, which is exactly what the Conservatives have done in the UK. But in politics, you have to offer the electorate at least something to grasp onto.
I'm not a fan of Starmer. His faction deliberately undermined Jeremy Corbyn to stop Corbyn being Prime Minister. This is not the actions of good people to be so disloyal. The traditional thing, even if you don't, you help them as best you can. If they get in, okay, great. Let's see what we can do. If they don't get in, well, we told you so, and then you rebuild. To deliberately undermine the leader like that is not something that should be praised or seen as a good thing. And Starmer, for a human rights lawyer, has not excelled himself on various attitudes towards world events. And it's hard to know what he stands for. I mean, I suppose we can't be disappointed because we don't know what he was going to do. But I don't think he will last 2 terms. I think he'll get through this term, but I think with the majority he looks like he's going to have, he will struggle to manage it except through bully boy tactics, which don't work ultimately. They work for the first few, and then suddenly everybody else thinks, hold on, if we stand up to the bully, I don't think he will be Margaret Thatcher or Disraeli or Pitt the Younger in office for years and years. I think he'll be closer to David Cameron or Anthony Eden. And again, we may find out that he is a towering figure, Churchillian in his outlook. Although as an Australian, of course, Churchill doesn't get a complete pass. Look at Singapore, for example, and Gallipoli. But it's the next gasp of, and probably the last gasp of, Blairism, which was a disaster for the British Labour Party. It cost the British Labour Party 15 or 20 years in Parliament. It achieved nothing and allowed for Cameron, who allowed a vote that he didn't manage properly, that he didn't care enough about to make sure it won. And now Britain is a pariah in its own continent, in economic straits that have never been so bad. I think is 1930s and the 1880s are the only comparable times, but with no real way out of it, because even Starmer himself suggested that he couldn't see Britain going back into the EU in his lifetime, whether that was just to assuage the fears of those few Brexiteers, or whether that's a genuine feeling of his that he doesn't think Britain should be part of the EU. The time to have got out of the EU was before they went into it.
Well, back in 1973.
73, they should have gone from there and said, no, we don't want to be part of this. After they were committed, everything gets tied up in it. And as those of us who've watched despairingly from afar have seen, it's been a disaster and a travesty. And really, Cameron, Johnson, Truss, the lot of them, Rees-Mogg, Farage, they all should be jailed. It's high treason.
Well, that's probably the reason why they were defeated so drastically in this election. But this overall election has been quite strange, and you're just left wondering, well, what's the whole political process or the whole election campaign process all about? And it's not just in the UK or in the United States or in France. It's the same process in Australia as well. It's not clear what people end up voting for. And obviously the Conservative Party in the UK, well, that's been a basket case, not for the entire 14 years in office, but definitely since at least the 2015 general election, when the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, he made a promise to Nigel Farage to hold a referendum on Britain leaving the European Union. Now, most Prime Ministers, after winning an election and making a stupid promise like that, would have said, sorry, Nigel, that's a stupid idea. I'm not going to give you that referendum. I've got what I want from you. I won the election. See you later. Goodbye. And maybe David Cameron at the time thought, well, I'll give this idiot what he wants because surely nobody's going to vote for Britain to leave the European Union. And guess what? He was totally wrong about that. And the decay of Britain and the Conservative Party, I think, can be traced back to that particular time. And despite all of that, the British Labour Party doesn't seem to stand for very much or represent very much, aside from not being Tory. And Keir Starmer did have a close look at what Anthony Albanese did in Australia, roll up into the smallest ball possible, so small that nobody can actually see it, and then win an election campaign, and then you're in government. But I do think that the way that a leader comes into office, it does define the way that they'll behave once they actually get into office. And we saw that in 2013 with Tony Abbott. He was a destroyer in opposition, continued to be a destroyer in government. Anthony Albanese kept on saying when he was in opposition that he'd be a very cautious Prime Minister. And I think that he said it so many times he started to believe it. And sure enough, once he got into office, he became a very, very, very cautious Prime Minister. So it will be interesting to see what happens with Keir Starmer. He's been absolutely ruthless with dissent. There was one candidate who liked a Facebook message about Palestine, and she was removed pretty quickly. He installed a Zionist into a safe Labor-held seat for no particular reason. He's been incredibly secretive as well in opposition. So it's not clear what Keir Starmer will be like as a Prime Minister, as we mentioned before. And, he's not even sure what he'll be like as a Prime Minister until he starts actually doing it. But it's just that we've got no idea because he's offered not very much at all.
Yeah, Starmer hasn't desperately impressed as a politician. There are nice stories around about him, about his generosity with his time before he was a politician or when he was a junior politician. And so that gives us a bit of hope that perhaps there might be a decent person in there.
He also knows how to play the violin.
There you go. He was copping a bit of stick for staying home on Friday nights with his Jewish wife while she practiced the rituals involved with the Shabbat, which, given he calls himself an atheist, seemed odd to a lot of people. But as someone pointed out, at least you know where he is on a Friday night if there's an emergency, unlike other prime ministers, say Boris Johnson, where he could be anywhere. The one I liked was it's a logistical impossibility for Boris Johnson to spend one night with all these kids. Yes, Starmer, I think, is setting the rod for his own back by not really thinking through being a small target, because they'll be looking for things to throw out, and unless you can control what they're throwing stuff at you for, you can be in a lot of trouble very quickly. And as some of the more radical backbenchers say, gain courage, it could become quite ugly.
Now, I think this is the end point of neoliberalism as well, and it started off in the UK with Margaret Thatcher in 1979, probably end in the UK as well. And Before people start sending in a history lesson about how neoliberalism started earlier than that, I think it was definitely fast-tracked by Thatcherism. But I think this story ends with Britain as a basket case on the edge of Europe looking in, and in some sense that's where it's always wanted to be, with all the Eurosceptics taking over the Conservative Party. And the Tories have been in office for 32 of the past 47 years, and and similar to what's happened in Australia. And this is the end result of long periods in office of Conservative governments. But there has been speculation that Keir Starmer has to do what the Hawke government had to do back in 1983, where they inherited a basket case economy that needed to make some long-term structural reforms, but had to implement them very quickly as well. But I think in Britain's case, it's possibly a case where there won't be any options. So there's probably a lot that will be happening in British politics over the next 6 months or so. And it's also a question of what this will mean for Australia. Having Labor governments in Britain and Australia isn't necessarily an advantage for Australia, although it does help. Having two like-minded Conservative twits like Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison as Prime Ministers did end up with the ridiculous AUKUS deals. Maybe Keir Starmer and Anthony Albanese will work out a plan to cancel the AUKUS deal, although it's so favourable to Britain that they'd probably be very reluctant to change anything on AUKUS. So I think we just genuinely will have to wait and see. And I know that we do say this very often when we come to look at the future in politics, but I think in this case it is quite true. It's still all a very big mystery.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
We do have a bit of an international flavour today, but there is a lot of international news that does relate to Australia. Now, we haven't had too much news in the mainstream media about the French elections, but it looks like the French people have looked at what's happening in Britain over the past 14 years and said, we like the mess that's been left behind, we want some of that. And after the second round of voting in a few weeks' time, France could have its first far-right government since the Second World War. In the United States, most of the focus was on a debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Joe Biden did have a terrible debate. There's no question about that.
Eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
And most of the discussion has been on Joe Biden needing to be replaced rather than Donald Trump, the convicted felon and someone who incited the Capitol Hill riots, also needing to be replaced, but that's the nature of American politics. There was also a Supreme Court ruling that provides some immunity for US presidents, which means that there's immunity for Donald Trump in his attempts to subvert the 2020 presidential election. And if these are deemed to be official acts of the President of the United States, there's probably immunity for his role in the Capitol Hill riots in January 2021. And that essentially means that the President is like a king or a queen of England. They can pretty much do whatever they want. And these issues, a swing to the far right in Europe, possible instability in the United States, I think these issues will affect Australia. And Australia isn't immune from global politics. Whatever happens in those countries will always have an influence in Australia, even if it is indirectly. But the world just seems to be going through some major political shifts at the moment.
I think the electorate is moving in a progressive way, and for every revolution, there's an equal and opposite counter-revolution. And so those parts of the electorate that don't want that progressive shift have come back. Le Pen in France shouldn't be electable at all, but the more moderate governments have disappointed, I think. My friend Dr. Andrew Shields has likened it to the 1930s, where most of the moral leadership in the left collapses, and this leads to the rise of fascism in the 1930s in Europe. And even in Britain and Australia, you get fascist movements. The New Guard in Australia and Oswald Mosley's Black Shirts in Britain. They don't become electorally successful, but they are a present, aided, of course, by a media who are very happy to promote far-right causes. But the French left seems to have collapsed, at least electorally, and the vacuum has been filled by Marie Le Pen and even the centre-right, who can be a buffer against that type of stuff, has not been strong enough. Now, whether Le Pen becomes the next president or not remains to be seen, but early indications shows that it's going to be a Le Pen presidency for the next few years.
And we are getting these flashpoints around the world at the moment. Some are big, some are small, but it's leading to a fundamental shift in global politics in Europe, the United States, Africa, Middle East, South America. Different countries seem to be going through their different stages of trying out populist and extremist politics. And we did see some of that after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, where there was a new wave of right-wing nationalism throughout Eastern Europe. And the thinking was, well, communism was bad, therefore the opposite of that, nationalism, well, that must be good. Central planning was bad, therefore the opposite of that, unbridled capitalism, well, that must be good too. So I think that we're probably going through something very similar throughout the world at the moment. Different countries trying out certain levels of extremism because they're not happy with what governments are doing and they're looking for alternatives. And we had our go with Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison. Britain had Boris Johnson. Brazil had Jair Bolsonaro, Donald Trump in the US, possibly making a return as well. And they were all turfed out pretty quickly. Argentina decided to have a go with a lunatic as well, Javier Milei. He's a populist as well, but he's only in his first year of the term and he's not looking very good either. So it's almost like it's a failure of establishment politics. If they're not producing solutions, it seems that the population always defers to the far right. It happened in the 1930s in Europe. It's starting to happen now. It never works, but people always go back to it for some reason. And in most countries around the world, I think there's always a fine balance between progressive and conservative or left and right politics. But it's hard to know exactly what's causing these problems. You know, whether governing within the current structures that exist is just too difficult or that we're just not getting the right sort of people into politics. And we can say that it's definitely the case in the United States at the moment, not getting the right people into politics. We're in a country that's got a population of 330 million people, and the two best candidates that you've got are Donald Trump and Joe Biden. You know, one's probably going to campaign from jail, the other one's probably going to campaign from a hospital bed. I think that's probably one of the problems, not getting the right people into politics, and I think we just have to work out ways of improving that.
It's certainly not paying more money. Look at Australia. We didn't want to pay peanuts for monkeys and we paid more than peanuts and got baboons. So I think we need to get back to decent education and teaching people at school properly, not just the obligatory trip to Canberra where kids punch each other through the halls of Parliament House while a guide tries to talk over the top of them. I think we need proper education on how it works and why it's important you engage, even if it's only for 6 weeks every 3 years here and for 4 years in France and what have you. Now, the French have a fairly good education system, but I've always been a bit wary of a country that throws up a riot every 6 weeks. Suggests to me that there's something missing, that there are other ways than violence and disruption. Sometimes there's not, of course, but they do have a lot of riots there. Things aren't going to get any duller over the next few months and even years. I think that's fair to say, and that may be the best thing we can say about the next few months or years.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
have to